Next laureate is Professor Ezekiel Emanuel. Please join us up here. Let me just say a few words. Professor Emanuel is Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and the Diane V.S. Levi and Robert M. Levi University Professor and Chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a physician, a policymaker, a scholar, founded no less than 2 departments of bioethics, one at the National Institute of Health and one at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Emanuel is renowned for advancing the field of bioethics by combining his skills as a physician and a policymaker. He is a pioneer in the fields of end-of-life care, public health, and specifically medical care and insurance. Also has contributed a great deal to the ethics of medical research. He has published over 300 scholarly articles, authored 6 books, and is the most cited bioethicist in the world. His books include, among others, and the titles here I think are revealing, so I'll just mention a few of them: Reinventing American Healthcare, How the Affordable Care Act Will Improve Our Terribly Complex, Blatantly Unjust, Outrageously Expensive, Grossly Inefficient, Error-Prone System, also Healthcare Guaranteed, A Simple Secular Solution for America, and his memoir, Brothers Emanuel. He is also the editor of the Oxford textbook on clinical research ethics. Professor Emanuel is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the chair of the Meta Council on the Future of Healthcare, committed to the World Economic Forum. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine and many other contributions to the field. His career is marked by an unusual ability to blend scholarship, teaching, and policy work, and he has had a profound influence on public discourse. I will have the honor of having a conversation with Professor Emanuel. I am here from the law school and also the director of the Veneer Institute. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So I first came across your work when I was a graduate student at Berkeley over 20 years ago. I was writing my work on the history of euthanasia, and the only existing serious contribution to the history of euthanasia in the United States was a piece that you had written. And I remember even at the time asking myself, why would a medical physician decide to contribute their life to bioethics? It's one thing when philosophers do that, and Baroness Warnock has said philosophers who are not committed to anything worldly, but it's another thing for a physician who can actually save lives to decide to move to the field of bioethics. So I want to ask you, how did it come about that you decided to devote much of your life to bioethics, and how important do you see bioethics?
Well, there's a sort of autobiographical answer, which is I'm the oldest born child of a Jewish immigrant father in the United States, and that almost guarantees I had to be a doctor. So my parents very much wanted me to be the doctor in the family, and given that I had 2 brothers who were talented but not talented in science, it fell upon me to become the doctor. But I did not actually like the idea of treating people. I divide the world into 2 types: people who like to handle and help other people address their problems individually. My father is that kind of person. He really loves people individually and solving their problems. My eldest daughter is like that. I prefer to solve policy problems and then by that help people individually. And so being a doctor, caring for patients one-on-one, even though I enjoyed the patients very much, did not appeal to me. So that's sort of how I got to the sort of situation. And why bioethics? When I was doing my clinical work, it was obvious, became obvious to me that we were doing a horrible job, and in particular at that time, a horrible job. This was in the early to mid 1980s, a horrible job on end-of-life care. That we were resuscitating the wrong people, that we couldn't even think about it clearly, and that I thought I could contribute to that. I had done an undergraduate degree in chemistry and philosophy, so I thought I had could have a special abilities to address the problem by bringing together the two halves of my previous work. So I took off from medical school and worked on political philosophy.
So people who are familiar with the field of bioethics know that a lot of bioethics is about individual rights, and specifically a lot of the research in bioethics has focused on beginning and end of life. And your research too, to an extent, has also dealt with topics, especially at the end of life. But I think there's a move, or at least some of us see a move from discussing these issues on the individual basis to discussing questions of public health and public policy as central questions to bioethics. And your contribution in this sense is important. As I mentioned in the introduction, your discussions of medical care and medical insurance is one example. The distribution of scarce resources is another. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and about your specific interests within the broader field of bioethics.
Well, first of all, you'll look really long and hard in almost all of my writing for the use of the word rights. I try to avoid the use of the word rights because I don't like to think about everything as a right here and a right there, because I think, first of all, it tends to be a club, and which rights you have and what the limits of those rights, I think, are much more important. So I tend to avoid thinking about that. And I also think I'm generally not as clever as Jonathan in sort of imagining worlds and trying to figure out what the right answer is in the future imagined world. And believe me, I think that actually one of our biggest problems is we don't do enough imagining. So I do think that the part of the problem of how to answer issues about neuroethics or genetic enhancements and things like that is that it's very difficult for us to imagine what will the world look like if that happens and it becomes a standard practice and everyone becomes inculcated in that standard practice. I'm not that kind of person. I don't do science fiction. I can't think science fiction like. I do think what I have a capacity to do is to stand back a little bit and say, all right, what are the values at stake here? How should we, given these values, how do we think about the multiple values that are at stake? And then what would it look like when played out in the real world? And that's what I think I've tried to do most, is to figure out what the right answer is and then how to play it out either in a policy way or practically in the real world. So I think just to give a concrete example, I began working on the allocation of absolutely scarce resources like organs for transplantation or flu vaccine in the case of a pandemic when I went to a presentation by someone talking about the American government's policy towards allocating flu vaccines should we have another pandemic. And this was in 2005, 2006, and the guy who wrote the government policy was presenting on it, and it just became obvious to me when he set out the hierarchy that, top of it would, of course, be people who, doctors and nurses who save lives, people who keep the communication system going, people who keep the food flowing and water flowing, and that below that would be people who were 65 years and older and had health problems, and that they were most likely to die, and so they should get the vaccine. And then you go down the list, funeral directors, and then healthy people. And below funeral directors is healthy people. And I'm saying that can't possibly be right. That's got to be wrong, that the last people to get a vaccine would be healthy people, and that the only principle they were using was, we got to minimize the number of deaths. And I was like, that can't be the right principle. So I got thinking, all right, so if that's not the right principle, what is the various principles? And then working backwards to figure out, okay, going from both sides. So what are the other principles that might be at stake? Prognosis and saving the most life years, and then working at the other end. Well, if I had limited resources, I want to save children first because they're going to live a long time, and they don't have multiple health problems and haven't lived a complete life already. So I figured out what the principles are and then what the right principles are. Good to say the federal government then did change its policy.
So one of the topics that you have been fighting for and writing about, including in your book, Healthcare Guaranteed, is universal health coverage. So I want to bring us from the world of principles to the reality, the political reality, and ask you to what extent was the Obama reform known as Obamacare a realization of what you had fought for, and to what extent is this reform in jeopardy?
Well, in jeopardy, I think the answer is not much. I think there's been an overplay, including by President Trump, of what the Republicans have done. It's still largely the framework of the healthcare system. What President Trump has done is made sure that the sort of engine of reform is no longer in the United States federal government. It's moved to the sort of private sector in the United States. And so if you want to help change the system, you have to work within the private sector. I think if you're, and this might go back to a question that both the Baroness and Professor Glover had got it addressed. I think one of the big mistakes academics in general, and not just philosophers, can make when they come into the public policy realm is to be doctrinaire about their solution. I have a healthy skepticism about democracy ever producing an A bill, a very good bill. Certainly no perfect bill. There are always compromises, and one needs to be, if you're going to get into the public policy world, willing to make compromises. I think the most important thing I learned is the question is what you're doing making the world better or going in the other direction? And as long as you're making the world better and improving the world, then what you're doing has good justification, even if it's not exactly your ideal situation. So I think it's always important to be willing to give up your ideal to get something that's going to be better and one hopes substantially better. So the Affordable Care Act is not very closely related to what I wanted, but in many respects, but it definitely made the world better. And so I think that's an important thing to be aware of when you move into the policy realm. You can't necessarily get the ideal, but you can get substantial improvements along the way. The second thing I think that's very important, political scientists, which I was trained as partially, they have this concept called path dependence. Reforms, we philosophers can think about reforms separate from institutional structures of a society. But when you're actually making reforms, you are stuck with the institutional structures of society. And it's a very rare society that will completely destroy a set of institutional structures and put in something totally different. So if you're making public policy reforms in a society, you're stuck with the institutional structures, and your reform typically can modify them but cannot completely change them. And so in the United States, we're stuck with a very complicated, multiple-headed monster in the healthcare field, and you're stuck with having to work within that set of constraints. Occasionally, when you're standing up a brand new program with no prior institutional structures, you can invent them, but that's a rare moment.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit about comparative bioethics, so to speak. And we were just talking about the American case, and I think the American case is central. And when we think about Israel and the United States, obviously in many aspects and in many domains, there's a very strong influence of American culture and politics, even models of leadership, one may argue, American influencing Israel.
Well, I thought it's the reverse here. We got Trump after Netanyahu.
Maybe. So we were talking for a long time about Clinton and Netanyahu. Maybe swings in different directions. But the point The point is that when it comes to bioethics, Israelis are quite shocked by the way bioethics questions are dealt with in the United States. The positions, but also the prominence of bioethical debates to American politics. The obvious example is the centrality of abortion to American politics, dividing left and right. But end-of-life decision-making has also become a highly politicized question in American politics. Obviously, what we had just discussed, the questions of medical insurance become prominent issues that organize American politics in a way that isn't the case in Israel, despite strong influence of religion also on Israeli politics. But we don't have the same kind of bioethical debates, nor the prominence of these debates in Israeli politics. So I wonder whether you could reflect on this from the American side and explain to an Israeli audience, some insight on how that works.
Well, I do think, to defend my country, I do think the questions of bioethics are in some ways the most fundamental and fundamentally interesting ethical questions out there. They are, as Jonathan's book says, they're about creating life and killing people. They're about allocating scarce resources and who's going to die, who's not going to die. They're about manipulating human beings and the question of whether you end up with the same person or a different person. I mean, I think all the questions are fundamentally among the most interesting questions about life that you can get. So the fact that they're central in the United States only suggests, well, this is a group of people who really think these questions matter, and they matter publicly. So that's one issue, and I do think the American bioethics has got an outsized field. I think the issue of the sort of level of conflict and the level of controversy over these questions does go back to the abortion debate. And it does go back to the fact that the United States is a much more pluralistic country than any other country, I think, in the world. Not pluralistic necessarily in where people come from, but pluralistic in the sense of, capaciousness for value differences, right? Israel's got 8 million people, not all of them, but the vast majority of them of Jewish heritage. Israel's pluralism is there for sure, but it's constrained. The United States, 320 million people, vast range of religions, and the spark of the abortion debate really unleashed a lot of the conflict among those value positions, and it has persisted now for 45 years, and it still is the nidus that brings out the divides. Having said all that, and I explored this issue of why we seem in the United States not able to resolve bioethical dilemmas in my book, The Ends of Human Life, which was all about the sort of value pluralism and the extent of it in the United States and the fact that we don't have a shared framework for solving it. There has, and I probably got it wrong in that book, or at least premature, there has been a kind of resolution about end-of-life care. It is quite clear that despite the hysteria of the far right about cases like Terry Schiavo, that in that case, the far right, the evangelical community and their ideological counterparts overplayed their hand, and the vast majority of Americans said, look, this is a matter between the patient, the family, and the doctor. It's not a matter for the Supreme Court. It's not a matter for the Senate. It's not a matter for the governor of Florida. It's a matter that's best dealt with in private, and people may have different views about it, and that's perfectly okay with the American polity, and we're going to let them decide. You want to keep your family on respirator forever? Okay. You don't? You want to pull out the respirator? Okay, we're going to accept that too. Now, when there's a conflict within a family, we don't have a great solution for that problem. But in this case, We have a very clear order of who makes decisions for someone who's incompetent. The husband made the decision, and everyone, the vast majority of the population that was the position they took, and they were very happy with it. And I would say, subsequently, there really hasn't been a similar blow up, because I think it just totally backfired on the right.
So I want to ask you a follow-up that moves from the United States to Israel. Now, as an outside observer of Israeli society, you are no foreigner to Israeli society. You have connections to this country. I wanted to ask you whether, not quite the question that Yael asked, although it would be nice if you have some tips for us, but maybe you have some insight about the kind of questions that we're struggling with in the field of bioethics, medical research, public health, the kind of question that you're interested in.
Far be it from me to comment without sufficient knowledge about the details. I did spend last night talking to people from the Ministry of Health, trying to figure out the craziness of the Israeli healthcare system and whether it can be remedied or not. But it did remind me very much that, at least on the healthcare system side of the world, every healthcare system has its strengths, and every healthcare system has its own disasters, own challenges, which is why when I get asked in the United States, well, what country has the world's best healthcare system? I say, terrible question, right? That they all have some positives and all have some challenges, and they're all likely to continue to have positives and challenges, because the costs are just spiraling out of control everywhere. Even if the United States is well ahead of the rest of the world, the pressures on every country because of medical costs are high, requiring choices that we really, really, really hate making as people. I notice that when I teach my students about allocating scarce resources and organs, they absolutely cannot stand the fact that if they give it to one person, the other person will die. So they're always trying to, well, can we cut it in half? And it's like, you can't cut a heart in half. It doesn't work. But I do think a large part of the choices that we're going to have to make about allocating resources as the pressures increase are going to be very, very unpalatable to people. So on that note, I would say one needs to understand the context. The other thing I would say about Israeli society, and this got to the question of a standing committee, we have had standing bioethics commissions in the United States. Trump is the first president not to have one. I think in general, the early ones were very helpful. So the very first one defined the sort of rules of research ethics, the rules set in the United States, and I think largely adopted throughout the world. I do have to say I get a little nervous, and here I maybe differ from the Baroness. I do think there's been a somewhat international breakdown around research ethics in the world. And, in the 70s and 80s, when a lot of new technologies were coming on, the dominant researchers, right, in the world, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, Israel even, there was a sort of shared cultural consensus, a shared understanding, for lack of a better word, and I know that many people scream at me for, there was a Western approach that built, in some ways, you can trace back to the Enlightenment. Now, research is much wider, much bigger. We've had a bunch of sort of questionable issues using CRISPR in China, well ahead of any consideration. We've had stem cell use in Korea. And one gets the sense that the sort of consensus, we make a consensus before we take a big leap in experimentation. I think it's broken down. And I've given you my explanation. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it does make me worried that lots of the United States could develop research rules and then more or less broadly adopted in the West, and then now it's not clear that those kind of things are gonna survive. The ability to sort of have a shared, and the Chinese have made quite clear, well, we might not agree with your research ethics rules. So, and that's, I think, a dangerous situation for all of us.
I see. So that's where you differ. I mean, that the plurality here, you think, is a danger, not a...
Yes, and that's where I differ from the Baroness, who I think was a little more optimistic than I am about the shared views going forward.
So speaking about controversies, you have not avoided controversies. In the past, you have been vehemently attacked by the right, by the fundamentalist right, on your alleged positions on euthanasia in the context of the death penalty and death panels. That is, that doctors would be encouraged to discuss with their patients how they want to end their lives in a way that was perceived by some people as promoting possibilities of euthanasia and doctors as killers.
And be paid for by the government, by the way.
By the government. And I think your position there was falsely construed to an extent on questions of euthanasia, at least, not on the panels. But occasionally you've also been attacked by at least an approach on the left on principles of equality. And this goes back to what you mentioned, but we didn't go into the details, and perhaps this will give you an opportunity to say a little bit more about the distribution of scarce resources. And in that context, one of the questions is, where do the elderly stand in questions of distribution of scarce organs? And you took a position, if I have it right, that it's legitimate to, so to speak, discriminate against elderly people, that they shouldn't have the same privilege as young people have on these questions. I'd like to hear more your position on this, maybe a little bit about the controversy and where you stand today.
I stand in the same place I stood before, and I don't. I reject the term discriminate against the elderly. They just don't have as high a priority, but it's not a matter of discrimination. It's not. I think if you ask the question, who should get a scarce resource in a life or death situation, and what principles ought you to use, it seems to me that one of the principles that stands in very high priority is you give it. So think of the values at stake. There's equality. There's sort of maximizing good. There's benefiting the worst off, and there's some instrumental values. And it seems to me that at least one of the plausible principles we ought to consider is to give organs to the least well off, where children are the least well off in the sense that they've lived the least life, and that therefore they ought to get priority, whereas an elderly person has lived their life, if not their full life, pretty close to their full life, and they ought to get lesser priority because they've been fortunate enough to get a full life. I think that's actually quite a plausible principle, and I might say I have used a test case of this. You have one liver to give, you've got three people, a 2-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 70-year-old, who gets it? And I've done this in scores of countries now, and I remember when I did it in China, the head said, well, we shouldn't do this. Of course the old person will get it. I said, I'm going to do it, and I'm not so sure you're right. And in fact, she wasn't right. It was, almost invariably the 20-year-old gets 2/3 to 80% of the people agree, and the young child gets the other 20%, and almost no one votes for the 70-year-old. It's not, the intuition, I think, is correct, which is young kids haven't had a lot of life to live, and the difference between the two and the 20-year-old, we can discuss the attachment to life, how much they've invested, the attachment to the future, the development of their own ideals and individuality. But that's the view I have. So I'm not discriminating against the old, but I do think priority ought to be given to the young, and I hold that position today, and nothing has induced me to change my position. And I will say that when we articulated that position and the American government was irritated, one of the ironies of that is I worked for the American government and was criticizing the American government's policy, which my boss didn't like. They then went out and did some interviews of average Americans to try to find out, is this crazy guy right, or, was our original policy right? They changed their policy closer to mine, precisely because most Americans agree, we ought to prioritize children.
So I have a follow-up, but perhaps this will go for a dinner conversation, because there's a question of the quantifiable aspect of a full life experience, and there's also a qualitative aspect of full life experience. And I also wonder whether people's opinions about this changes as people get older, and I mean, then that's also a question. I don't know if you want to follow up on this. I wonder what the audience thinks, but we can leave that for another discussion. Let me move to one of the topics that I know you've been most recently interested in, and that is questions of ethics in medical research. And you actually were here a year and a half ago, I think, as a guest of Tel Aviv University to discuss questions of medical research. You've spoken now about China and Korea, but maybe you can say more about where in the American context or generally, where you stand on these questions. I know that a lot of bioethics has focused on informed consent and questions of informed consent, and some of this is now being questioned, so maybe a little bit more about that. And there are people here who sit on ethics committees and may be interested.
So, I would say that one of the consequences in the United States, at least, and actually I think in the world in general, is we think about research ethics after a scandal. Right, so the world began thinking about research ethics after the Nazi medical atrocities, and we got the Nuremberg Code. And some people thought that was some overreach in the Nuremberg Code, and so we got the Declaration of Helsinki as a kind of rethink by the medical profession. Then in the United States, we had this infamous Tuskegee Experiment, where it turned out it wasn't so much an experiment, it was a natural history study just following African-American men who had syphilis and not treating them even though there was a treatment available. And the question was, we then created a national commission to look into that and make recommendations about the ethics of research and what the regulations ought to look like, because we had no regulations in the United States. And those regulations principally devolved into two parts, one part of which was you create an IRB or an ethics research committee or something that independently reviews the protocol and the research before it starts, so that it's not the researcher who determines whether it's ethical or not. And the second is that the individual ought to be giving informed consent unless there's a good reason they can't. They're children, they have Alzheimer's, and the research is important. And then we have some other mechanisms, always controversial about what should go. And I've always thought that this issue of informed consent, very important, but way overstated and way too much pressure put on it. And it's the only thing people recognize as a violation. They didn't give informed consent. And it seems to me that there's a previous question, which is separate from the informed consent. Was the research ethical? And so I do think one of my contributions to bioethics has been said, all right, what are the questions you ask and what order do you ask them? And you have to consider what's the social value of the research. Is it a valuable study or not? Because if it's not a valuable study, it doesn't matter whether they gave informed consent or not. Shouldn't have done it. Was it scientifically rigorous? Was it going to give you data or was it going to give you garbage? Because you can't put people at risk for garbage. And then there's, just selection of subjects. You have to choose your people fairly and justly, and that usually means that you shouldn't select only African-American sharecroppers when anyone. You can follow the natural history of anyone. You shouldn't only go to orphanages. You shouldn't do a lot of the things that had been done traditionally to do research, even great research. But I think the most important principle has always been, the research got risks and benefits, and how do they pan out? And I think that's the principle. It turns out if you look at all of bioethics, we have the hardest time delineating and quantifying, and yet I think it's the most important principle, much more important than informed consent, I would say. And because you don't really worry about informed consent if the research has minimal risks or no risks at all, and a lot of research has no risks at all. And so I have spent a lot of time trying to think about the risk-benefit ratio, how you would actually quantify it, what we should do to quantify it. And I think that's the value of that also is it's pretty objective. And I've also been critical of informed consent because what ends up happening if informed consent gets all the weight, we end up with these long informed consent documents, everyone gets confused, and it really, it turns out, if you look at it empirically, most people make their decision whether they're going to participate in research long before they get to the informed consent document. It's largely irrelevant for many, many people. So
we don't have a lot of times, and I'd like to at least offer the possibility to the audience that's been sitting so patiently and quietly throughout this to ask questions. I know also that Professor Emanuel would appreciate a question or two from the audience to the extent that we have time. I'd like to conclude my questions with looking into the future. Now, I know you just said a few minutes ago that you don't like the practice of foreseeing the future, but not the far future, not the science fiction future, but the one that is closer to us. And both ask you of what's your next topic of concern in the field of bioethics? Where do you think the stakes are high and bioethical intervention is required? And also, somewhat related, of the role of experts in bioethics and intellectuals in a world that is, I think, is becoming more and more populist and where there is much less room for a serious academic study of these questions influencing the general audience.
So first of all, I do think this issue of how we value, rank medical interventions versus everything else society needs to do is a fundamentally important question. And it is a very deep question on the allocation of resources, which we tend to avoid. That's what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. And again, it does get into some intergenerational questions of how much goes to the young, how much goes to the old, because a lot of government policies have that character in them. If a lot of money goes to pensions, it perforce goes to the elderly. If it doesn't, if it goes to education, it perforce goes to young people. And those kind of choices, I think, are really hugely value-laden choices, and we almost totally ignore them. And I think for a whole series of reasons, they're actually quite, at least in the United States, you can see them happening when legislatures and governors and presidents have to make budgetary choices. So that's something that I will spend a lot of time. And Jonathan, I think, mentioned one of the issues, which I do think is going to be fundamentally important over the next few years, and that's this sort of relationship between man and machine. And the relationship with AI, the relationship with potentially machines more powerful than men. And I think we don't understand how to think about them. I don't think we've done a good job of what would society look like under those circumstances. And you get a lot of really crappy answers. So I was in an audience once and heard Eric Schmidt, the former chairman of Google, say, "Oh, we would just pull the plug." That has got to be among the dumbest answers I've ever heard to a serious question. And even a huge misunderstanding of what the cloud computing really means and why the internet was invented, because no one can pull the plug. So I do think that is a fundamentally important question, and I do think similarly, if you get implants in the brain, what does that mean for human personality, human responsibility? I'm not sure. I am sure. I'm not the person to answer those questions. I don't have the capacity to answer those questions, but I do think someone's got to begin, and it really does require a lot of imagination about what society will look like.
Great. So we have 6 minutes, and I'd like to use 2 or 3 of those to allow people from the audience to have a say or pose a question as we.
Thank you. My question to you would be the role of NGOs. So I think you wrote a very interesting paper looking at interests and biases and whatever, and I'm wondering how you view the importance of NGOs in the bioethical discussion and policy making, and to what extent Do they have the role that we think that they should have, or is it just a tool? Or how do you see that?
Zeke, we'll take
A couple of questions?
then
Yeah,
you
fine.
can decide.
I'll try to remember them.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to relate to the two of you and maybe combine the points to make the question very short. If I want a title instead of end of life, healthy aging, in the consideration, and I want to put the environment and the consciousness that Jonathan was talking, and the involvement of engineering into the body, whether it's AI or any other equipment, and then have to make the decision that you were talking about, because the environment is a big interference in our quality of life, and this is the main issue. Not how long we live, but rather the quality of life, and then the consciousness, and then the involvement of the AI. And I want to put as the major concern, or maybe the research broadband interference or collaboration in providing a healthy aging, not longevity, but rather quality of life. How with you both discussion and prioritize, and also transparency will be involved.
One last question, briefly.
Notice you wimped
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you about the case that you spoke before about the aging and organ donation. And I think that your answer is perfectly fine with resources that are something like hospital beds or medicine, but in organs, there are the element of donation. And if you can take from an aged person, you need to provide him with or her with an organ. How do you consider this element in your consideration?
Three very different questions. So maybe I'll address this question of healthy aging. Look, I think it's very important to have healthy aging. And I think, in the abstract, if you ask an audience, is it quality of life or quantity of life? They always say quality of life, and then they always opt for quantity of life. I never want to die, or I may have a stream, or something crazy like this. I am somewhat infamous in the United States for saying, I think 75 is good enough, and stop trying to push the limits. And I think what we should do is instead of worrying about, what's the life expectancy of a country, we should say, well, we want 100% of the population to get to 75, and then we really don't care. We shouldn't care. And we want them to get to 75 and be, physically fit at 75. Part of the problem is people think, I'm going to get more years and they're all going to be in the 30s. Doesn't work that way. You get more years and they're all going to be in the 90s. If you look at what happens when we're, in general, and again, you're speaking about averages because we're, one of the great things about doing public policy is you can speak out about averages and you don't have to worry about the long tails, in part because, we're all average. There are a few, Baroness is one, there are a few people who are outliers. No, that's true, who are really outliers, published books in their 90s, etc. They turn out to be incredibly rare. If you look at the actual curve of, productivity, mental functioning, etc., it's got a very usual curve, and it sort of amazingly ends at 75. Alzheimer's disease goes like this, and poof, at 75, and lots of things happen at 75. Physical functioning has actually deteriorated, not increased. So I'm all for healthy aging, but I'm not all for let's live longer ad mea versari. Okay, that's the first thing. Remind me of your question. I had a good NGOs. I have a lot of trouble with NGOs, and I'll just put it out on the table. They do a lot of good, and as we've learned from Oxfam, they do a lot of bad. And part of the problem is there's not a lot of accountability for NGOs. They have, for a lot of reasons, wrapped themselves in the knight in shining armor. We're honest, we're the good guys, we're holding everyone else accountable. And the problem is that they make a lot of judgments, some of which I think are quite harmful. And there is no accountability that we've invented yet for NGOs. And we are now uncovering, Oxfam is only the most extreme case of the fact that maybe not so good. I myself have some difficulty with Doctors Without Borders. You know, they rush into emergency situations and then they leave. Well, wait a second, you know? Emergencies may not be the right way to address things. It's very expensive to address emergencies. It doesn't leave permanent structures and institutions and things you need. They have slightly changed their view. They and I have big conflicts, for example, over using second best treatments in developing countries where they're cheap and you can get them to more people. They want only first best treatments in a lot of contexts. So I have a great deal of difficulty with NGOs making policy and decisions in the world. It's not to say they shouldn't be around the table, but like every other organization, I believe in accountability. And I think we ought to figure out a way to make them much more accountable than just to say, oh, they're the knight in shining armor, always doing good. They might be devoted to doing good, and we know many people who've been devoted to doing good end up doing a lot of bad along the way. And I'll give you one concrete example. I do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work in developing countries in Africa. And one of the big problems is you've got a lot of NGOs that come in, they hire the most talented people, they pay them a lot more, they give them a lot of resources, and they suck out human quality resources from operating in the country, teaching, providing actual care, etc. You know, along the way of doing good, they're actually doing this other thing, and we've never evaluated which is better. There are many highly respected people. I'll give you Angus Deaton, the recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, professor at Princeton, Scott, has written very, very negatively, not about NGOs per se, but just in general about global assistance, because he thinks it creates lots of problems, undermines democracy, undermines governmental accountability, and NGOs are, I think, very much in that ballpark. So I myself am conflicted about what they do.